What if I told you that one of history's most legendary generals possessed a secret weapon that had nothing to do with firepower, tank design, or troop numbers? What if the key to his success was something his enemies could never quite grasp, even when they knew he was coming? This is the story of how General George S. Patton, Jr. consistently outmaneuvered, outpaced, and outsmarted the formidable German Wehrmacht, not through superior force alone, but through a revolutionary approach to warfare that would change military strategy forever. While the world saw his pearl-handled revolvers and heard his thunderous speeches, few understood the sophisticated system that made him arrive at the battlefield before anyone thought possible. Stay with me until the end, because what Patton mastered then is still being studied and applied by military strategists today. The year was 1944, and across the blood-soaked fields of Europe, German commanders were experiencing something they'd rarely encountered: fear. Not the kind of fear that comes from overwhelming numbers or superior technology, but something far more unnerving. They called it the Patton problem. Time and again, when German forces believed they had time to regroup, to fortify, to prepare their defenses, American armor would appear on the horizon. Not tomorrow, not next week, but now. Leading those columns was a man who seemed to defy the very laws of warfare itself. George S. Patton, Jr. was born into military aristocracy. His family's military heritage stretched back through generations, with ancestors who had fought in the Revolutionary War and the Civil War. From childhood, he was steeped in the classics, devouring accounts of Alexander the Great, Hannibal, Julius Caesar, and Napoleon Bonaparte. But Patton wasn't content to simply admire these ancient commanders. He studied them obsessively, searching for the principles that made them victorious. What he discovered would become the foundation of his revolutionary approach to modern warfare. When other American officers were learning by the book, Patton was reading German military literature. He studied Hans von Seeckt's memoirs from World War I. He absorbed Adolf von Schell's insights on battle leadership. But perhaps most importantly, he studied the early German blitzkrieg campaigns against Poland and France with the intensity of a man looking for something specific. And he found it. The Germans had unlocked something powerful: the war of movement. Speed, shock, and relentless pressure could achieve what months of static warfare could not. But here's where Patton diverged from merely copying the enemy. While he admired the German concepts, he recognized their critical flaw. The Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg relied heavily on tactical brilliance at the operational level, but it lacked a crucial element that Patton would perfect: a truly comprehensive intelligence system. This would become his secret weapon, the invisible advantage that would confound his enemies throughout the war. Patton developed what he called a multi-layered intelligence system, a network so sophisticated that it gave him what military strategists call information dominance. At the heart of this system was his G2 intelligence officer, Colonel Oscar Koch, a brilliant analyst who Patton trusted implicitly. Every morning, Koch would brief Patton on enemy dispositions, capabilities, and most importantly, weaknesses. These weren't just reports. They were surgical analyses of where the enemy was vulnerable, where they were strong, and where they expected to be hit. But intelligence gathering was just the first layer. Patton deployed armored reconnaissance units that ranged far ahead of his main forces. These weren't casual patrols. They were aggressive probes designed to find gaps in enemy lines. Light aircraft, normally used as artillery spotters, were repurposed for aerial reconnaissance. Fighter pilots flying close air support would radio back real-time intelligence about enemy movements. Patton even utilized ultra-intelligence, the decoded German communications that gave the Allies an unprecedented window into enemy planning. The genius wasn't in having these intelligence sources. Other commanders had access to similar information. The genius was in how Patton synthesized it all and then acted on it with breathtaking speed. While other generals waited for perfect intelligence, Patton understood that good intelligence acted upon immediately was infinitely more valuable than perfect intelligence received too late. This brings us to perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of Patton's success, his philosophy of constant offensive action. Many people think Patton was reckless, that his aggression was born from ego or bloodlust. The truth was far more calculated. Patton had studied military history deeply enough to recognize a fundamental principle. In warfare, the defender always suffers more casualties over time than the attacker who maintains momentum. His reasoning was elegantly simple. When you're moving forward rapidly, the enemy is retreating. A retreating enemy isn't organizing counterattacks, isn't building fortifications, isn't calling in artillery strikes with accuracy. A retreating enemy is disorganized, demoralized, and desperate. The faster you advance, the less fighting you actually have to do. Every hour you give the enemy to reorganize is an hour they use to make themselves deadlier. Patton articulated this philosophy in stark terms. An army is defeated when it digs in. He detested defensive positions so much that when he found slit trenches dug around a command post in Tunisia, he urinated in one to make his point. His message was clear. We don't hide from the enemy. We make them hide from us. But speed without direction is chaos. This is where Patton's second major innovation came into play, mission-type orders. He borrowed this concept from the German military doctrine of Auftragstaktik. Instead of telling his subordinate commanders exactly how to accomplish a mission, he told them what needed to be accomplished and let their tactical expertise determine the how. This approach created something remarkable, an army that could adapt and exploit opportunities without waiting for orders from above. Patton once said, "Never tell people how to do things. Tell them what to do, and they will surprise you with their ingenuity." This wasn't just a pithy quote, it was operational doctrine. When a tank commander on the ground spotted a weakness in enemy lines, he didn't need to radio back for permission to exploit it. He knew his commander's intent was always the same: attack, penetrate, exploit. This decentralized command structure meant Patton's forces could react to battlefield opportunities in real time, while enemy forces were still waiting for orders from their high command. The third element of Patton's secret was his mastery of combined arms coordination. This wasn't revolutionary in theory. Most armies understood that infantry, armor, artillery, and air power worked better together than apart. But Patton refined it to an art form. His tanks didn't just punch through enemy lines, they were accompanied by self-propelled artillery positioned well forward, ready to provide immediate fire support. Armored infantry followed closely, ready to consolidate gains. And overhead, tactical fighter bombers flew constant cover, coordinated by forward air controllers riding in the lead tanks. This was the technique of armored column cover, and it transformed the battlefield. Each of Patton's advancing columns was protected by a combat air patrol of 3 to 4 P-47 or P-51 fighter bombers. German forces trying to counterattack or establish defensive positions found themselves immediately under air attack. The psychological effect was devastating. German soldiers began to fear even showing themselves when American armor was near. The fourth, and perhaps most crucial element of Patton's secret, was logistics. This seems mundane compared to tactics and strategy, but it was the engine that made everything else possible. Patton's G4 logistics officer, Colonel Walter J. Mueller, emphasized flexibility and improvisation. While other armies waited for supply lines to catch up with doctrine, Patton's supply units were trained to adapt on the fly. His philosophy was simple: find a way or make one. This logistical flexibility meant that Patton's forces could sustain offensive operations when other armies would have had to pause and regroup. Fuel, ammunition, and supplies flowed forward relentlessly. When conventional supply methods failed, Patton improvised. He once ordered C-47 transport aircraft to drop supplies to his advancing columns. treating his own troops like airborne units behind enemy lines. Nothing was allowed to slow the advance. Now let me tell you about the moment when all these elements came together in perhaps the most dramatic demonstration of Patton's method, the relief of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. On December 16, 1944, the Germans launched their last great offensive in the West. More than 200,000 troops and nearly 1,000 tanks smashed into the American lines in the Ardennes forest. The objective was audacious: reach the port of Antwerp, split the Allied armies, and force a negotiated peace. The attack achieved complete surprise, and American forces reeled backward, creating a massive bulge in the Allied lines. At the center of this bulge was a small Belgian town called Bastogne. It didn't look like much, just a rural crossroads. But every major road in the region went through Bastogne. Whoever controlled it controlled movement through the entire Ardennes. The Germans knew this. They surrounded the town on December 20th, trapping the 101st Airborne Division and various armored and infantry units inside. The situation was desperate. The defenders were outnumbered, running low on ammunition and medical supplies. The weather was so bad that air supply drops were nearly impossible. German commanders sent a surrender ultimatum. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's one-word response, "Nuts," would become legendary. But bravery alone wouldn't save Bastogne. They needed relief, and they needed it fast. Here's where the story gets extraordinary. On December 19th, General Dwight Eisenhower called an emergency meeting at Verdun. Present were Eisenhower, his chief of staff, General Walter Bedell Smith, General Omar Bradley, who commanded the 12th Army Group, and Patton. Eisenhower outlined the situation and asked Patton how quickly he could disengage from his current offensive toward the Saar River, turn his entire Third Army 90 degrees north, and counterattack into the southern flank of the German penetration. To the disbelief of everyone in the room, Patton replied, "I can attack with 2 divisions within 48 hours." The other generals thought he was being his usual bombastic self. Eisenhower, more diplomatically, asked, "Don't be fatuous, George. If you go that early, you won't have all 3 divisions ready, and you'll go piecemeal. You'll be taking an awful risk." Patton looked Eisenhower in the eye and said, "I'll attack in 48 hours, and I'll have 3 divisions, not 2. What the other commanders didn't know was that Patton had been preparing for exactly this moment. Remember his sophisticated intelligence system? Colonel Koch had been warning since late November that the Germans were building up forces for a counteroffensive. While higher headquarters dismissed these warnings, Patton believed his intelligence officer. Before leaving for the Verdun meeting, he had already ordered his staff to prepare 3 contingency plans for a northward turn. This is the secret in action. While other commanders were just learning about the crisis, Patton's forces were already beginning to move. On the morning of December 22nd, less than 72 hours after the German attack began, Patton launched his counteroffensive with 3 full divisions. The 3 corps, consisting of the 4th Armored Division, the 26th Infantry Division, and the 80th Infantry Division, wheeled north and smashed into the southern flank of the German advance. The operation that Patton described as simple was actually a logistical and tactical miracle. His staff had to coordinate the movement of over 133,000 vehicles and tanks, redirect supply lines, brief commanders on new objectives, and do it all while maintaining operational security. The roads were icy, the weather was brutal, and the Germans were fully aware that Patton was coming. But knowing he was coming and stopping him were 2 different things. Patton drove his forces relentlessly. He personally inspected the roads, clearing traffic jams, berating officers whose units were moving too slowly, and constantly pushing forward. When he encountered a convoy of trucks with trailers, he ordered the trailers removed so they could move faster. Speed wasn't just a goal, it was an obsession. Every hour mattered because every hour delayed meant more American paratroopers dying in Bastogne. His intelligence system continued to feed him real-time information about German positions and movements. His reconnaissance units probed constantly, looking for weak points, and when they found them, his armored spearheads exploited them instantly. The 4th Armored Division, led by Major General Hugh Gaffey, became the tip of Patton's spear, fighting through German defenses with a combination of tactical skill and sheer audacity. German forces tried desperately to stop the advance. They threw their best units into the fight, elite Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions that had been devastating Allied forces for days. But they faced something they couldn't counter, an enemy who refused to give them time to prepare. Patton's forces attacked constantly from multiple directions, never allowing the Germans to establish a coherent defensive line. On December 26th, exactly when Patton had promised, the first elements of the 4th Armored Division broke through to Bastogne. The lead tank, nicknamed Cobra King, rolled into the perimeter of the 101st Airborne at 4:50 p.m. The siege was broken. What military experts had said would take weeks, Patton had accomplished in less than a week. But here's what makes this achievement even more remarkable. Patton didn't just relieve Bastogne and stop. While other commanders would have consolidated, rested, and resupplied, Patton kept attacking. His philosophy was that the enemy was disorganized and vulnerable, and you don't give a wounded enemy time to recover. His forces continued to push east, rolling back the German advance and turning what Hitler had hoped would be a decisive victory into a catastrophic defeat. The Battle of the Bulge ultimately cost the Germans 100,000 casualties, 800 tanks, and 1,000 aircraft. More importantly, it destroyed Germany's last strategic reserve. After the Bulge, the Wehrmacht would never again be capable of a major offensive. The war in Europe would end less than 5 months later. Patton's success at Bastogne wasn't luck. It was the culmination of everything he had been preparing for throughout the war. His intelligence system had given him advance warning. His logistical preparations had made the rapid turn possible. His philosophy of constant offensive action had kept the initiative. And his mission-type orders had allowed his subordinate commanders to exploit opportunities without waiting for instructions from above. But the secret went even deeper than this. Patton understood something fundamental about warfare that many commanders miss. War is fundamentally about time and psychology as much as it is about firepower. By consistently arriving before the enemy expected, Patton didn't just gain tactical advantages, he got into his enemies' heads. German commanders began to make decisions based not on what Patton was doing, but on what they feared he might do. They held back reserves to guard against possible Patton attacks that never came. They rushed to fortify positions before Patton's forces could arrive, exhausting their troops in the process. They second-guessed their own intelligence because Patton's actual movements so rarely matched what seemed logical or possible. This psychological dominance was Patton's ultimate secret weapon. The German High Command had more respect for Patton than for any other Allied commander. They considered him central to any invasion plan. This respect was so profound that the Allies used it against them in Operation Fortitude, the deception plan for D-Day. By making the Germans believe Patton was commanding a massive fictional army group preparing to invade at Pas-de-Calais, the Allies kept German reserves away from Normandy for crucial weeks after the invasion. The Germans respected Patton not because he had more tanks or better equipment. He often didn't. They respected him because he consistently did what they thought impossible. He arrived when they needed more time. He attacked when they expected him to defend. He exploited weaknesses before they could shore them up. He moved his forces with a speed that seemed to violate the known limitations of logistics and organization. Now, You might be thinking, surely Patton's methods had weaknesses. And you'd be right. His aggressive approach required enormous resources. His rapid advances sometimes outran his supply lines, creating temporary vulnerabilities. His relentless pressure on his troops led to high rates of combat fatigue. And his personality, abrasive, demanding, often offensive, made him many enemies among his peers and superiors. But here's the crucial point. Patton had done the calculations. He understood that his method, despite its costs, saved lives overall. A short, intense campaign with rapid movement resulted in fewer casualties than a prolonged campaign of attrition. Every day you delayed pushing the enemy back was another day they could bring up reinforcements, improve their positions, and inflict casualties on your troops. Patton's forces sometimes suffered higher casualties in the short term, but they accomplished their objectives faster and with lower total losses. The numbers bear this out. During the campaigns across France and into Germany, Patton's Third Army consistently advanced faster and suffered proportionally fewer casualties than other Allied armies. From August 1st, 1944, when Third Army became operational, to May 7th, 1945, when the war ended, Patton's forces liberated or conquered 81,522 square miles of territory. They captured 1,280,688 prisoners of war. They inflicted an estimated 111,288 casualties on enemy forces, while suffering 160,692 casualties themselves, a ratio that speaks to the effectiveness of rapid maneuver over static warfare. But Patton's secret wasn't just about the war he was fighting. It was about all wars. What he had developed was a comprehensive doctrine of mechanized warfare that combined intelligence dominance, speed of movement, decentralized command, combined arms coordination, and logistical flexibility into a coherent system. After World War II ended, military strategists began to seriously study what Patton had done and why it had worked so well. The tragedy is that Patton died in a traffic accident in December 1945, just months after the war ended. He never had the opportunity to directly influence post-war military doctrine, but his methods lived on. The principles he refined, rapid maneuver, exploitation of enemy weakness, maintenance of initiative, integration of intelligence with operations, became foundational elements of modern military strategy. You can see Patton's influence in the doctrine of air-land battle that guided U.S. Army thinking during the Cold War. You can see it in the emphasis on speed and maneuver in the 1991 Gulf War. You can see it in the shock and awe campaign that opened Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003. Every modern military force studies Patton's campaigns, not just as history, but as a masterclass in how to conduct mobile warfare. What made Patton's secret so powerful was that it wasn't really a secret at all. He wrote about his methods. He taught them to his subordinates. He explained his thinking in speeches and orders. The German commanders knew what he was doing. They had their own similar doctrines. But knowing what Patton was going to do and stopping him were two different things. Because executing his method required not just understanding the principles, but having the organizational capability, the logistical infrastructure, the trained personnel, and above all, the will to move faster and hit harder than seemed reasonable or possible. The genius of Patton was that he built an entire army around speed, not just in movement, but in thinking, deciding, and acting. From the reconnaissance scout who spotted a gap in enemy lines, to the tank commander who exploited it, to the artillery forward observer who called in supporting fire, to the logistics sergeant who ensured ammunition was where it was needed. Every part of Patton's Third Army was optimized for one thing: arriving at the decisive point before the enemy thought possible. Think about it this way. In most armies, each level of command adds delay. The scout reports to the platoon leader, who reports to the company commander, who reports to the battalion commander, who reports to division, who reports to corps, who finally gets the information to the commanding general, who makes a decision that has to flow back down through all those levels before action is taken. By the time forces move, the opportunity is often gone. Patton's system collapsed those decision cycles. His scouts knew what the general wanted: find the enemy's weak points. His tank commanders knew what to do when those weak points were found: attack immediately. His artillery officers knew when to fire, whenever supporting fire would help the advance. His logistics officers knew what was needed, whatever it takes to keep the advance moving. Decisions happened at the level where the information existed, dramatically speeding the entire operational cycle. This is why Patton always seemed to arrive before the enemy expected. It wasn't magic. It wasn't luck. It was a carefully constructed system that minimized decision time, maximized information flow, and ruthlessly prioritized speed of action over perfection of planning. Patton knew that a good plan executed now was infinitely better than a perfect plan executed tomorrow, because tomorrow the enemy would be ready. The secret that made Patton always arrive before the enemy was this: he understood that modern warfare wasn't won by the army with the most firepower or the best technology. It was won by the army that could process information faster, make decisions faster, and act faster than the enemy. He built an intelligence system that told him where to strike. He developed a command philosophy that let his subordinates act without waiting for orders. He trained his forces to move constantly, attack relentlessly, and never give the enemy time to breathe. And he had the logistical capability to sustain that pace of operations. But perhaps most importantly, Patton had something that can't be taught: the absolute conviction that his method would work, and the iron will to drive it forward despite doubts, setbacks, and criticism. Lesser commanders would have hesitated. They would have waited for better intelligence, for more supplies, for more favorable conditions. Patton attacked when he had good enough intelligence, adequate supplies, and acceptable conditions. And by attacking while his enemies were still waiting for perfect conditions, he won. This is the secret that military forces around the world still study today. This is why Patton's name appears in every advanced military strategy course. This is why his campaigns are analyzed and reanalyzed by officers hoping to understand how one man could so consistently achieve what others thought impossible. The secret wasn't complicated, but executing it. Building an entire military organization around principles of speed, intelligence, and aggressive action. That was the genius. So the next time someone asks what made George S. Patton such a successful commander, the answer isn't his famous temper, his colorful language, or his pearl-handled revolvers. It was his secret system, a multi-layered intelligence apparatus that found enemy weaknesses, a command philosophy that empowered subordinates to exploit those weaknesses immediately, a combined arms approach that brought overwhelming force to bear at the decisive point, and the logistical capability to sustain operations faster than the enemy could respond. Patton always arrived before the enemy because he had built an army designed to do exactly that. And in doing so, he changed the face of warfare forever. Now, it's your turn. What did you think of this story? Did you know about Patton's sophisticated intelligence system, or did you think he was just a reckless charger? What aspects of his tactics do you find most interesting? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We need 100 comments to keep bringing you these incredible stories from World War II. And if you want, tell me from which part of the world you're watching this video. Your comment matters, and I want to read it and reply. For more exciting stories like this one, click on the video appearing on your screen right now.